Hey guys, my name's Chris, I live in Australia, and today I'm down in Sydney, and I want to ask you guys a question. Could you afford to live in Sydney? Would you settle down in Sydney? Would you buy a house in Sydney? Sure, it's a beautiful city, but it is the second most expensive property market in the world. To put in perspective how expensive it is, if you were 18 years old, starting out in life, and start to save for a deposit, well, paying your rent, paying your bills, especially in this cost of living crisis we're in right now, if you were starting at 18 years old, it would be 46 years old before you have your 20% deposit down on a house. So it would take you most of your working career just to get your deposit. So housing is unaffordable. If you're on the median income, housing is unaffordable in Sydney. I had to look around through Sydney, and even to an hour outside of Sydney, it's still unaffordable to the person on the median income in Australia. So if the youth of Sydney, if the working class of Sydney can't afford to buy a house in Sydney, why would they stay in Sydney? I think there's going to be an exodus. I think people are going to flood out of Sydney in the hundreds of thousands to the millions. Now, there's that many million people in Sydney, but you know, if they lose 1 or 2 million people because housing is so unaffordable, and they shift states, they move out to more affordable areas, well, you know, that's going to collapse the city. The city is not going to withstand that amount of people leaving. So if you live in Sydney right now, how are you affording to live, man? How are you affording this? Maybe you're renting. Is rent killing you in Sydney right now? I know I couldn't afford to buy a house out here. Maybe I could just scrape by on rent, but you know, it'd be rice and beans all the way through. How are you living? Is it just you're paying everything across to the cost of your property? I had to look at Mount Druitt. It's one of the rougher areas of Sydney, to my understanding. It's out western Sydney. The median house price in Mount Druitt is now just about to hit $1 million. That's the median. That's not the most expensive, but it's just sitting right there in the middle, $1 million for Mount Druitt. So if you can't afford to settle down in Sydney, if you can't afford to start a family, you can't afford to raise a family in Sydney, can't afford your own house to do that thing that a lot of us aspire to do, let alone just having that security towards retirement. If you can't do that in Sydney, well, you're going to move out, aren't you? Unless you just want to be in the rat race your entire life. So I think there's going to be 1 million, 2 million people over the next decade actually exodus out of Sydney. We're already at the point in Sydney where there's 10% of the housing is actually vacant. Whether that's from investors, of course, turning around and saying, you know what, I'm making $50,000, $100,000 a year in equity growing just from having this piece of property in Sydney. It's just appreciating in value. I don't even need to put people in there. It's too much of a hassle. I'm making money hand over fist anyway. People can't afford the rent. People can't afford to buy it. It's crazy. It's crazy. So how can you start a life in Sydney? How could you settle down in Sydney? How could you afford to live here? How could you retire here? I think people are doing the numbers. They're realizing, hey, you can't do that. It's unaffordable. It's grossly unaffordable. Even an hour out, unaffordable. Over the last 5 years, property prices have increased 57%. The median house in Sydney is now $1.6 million, and the median unit, for those who are like, oh, just get a unit then, it's just over $800,000 in Sydney. So the median unit, median house is out of reach. It's out of reach to the person on the median income. So that's an issue. So that's why we're going to start to see, well, I think we're going to see an exodus out of Sydney. People are going to start to run the numbers and say, hey, I can't settle down here. I can't afford to live here. It's too expensive. I'm shifting states. Saw a lot coming up to Queensland. That's my lovely state. People from down south selling up, coming up to Queensland because it's more affordable, even though now Queensland's becoming unaffordable. But that's the internal migration happening. People shifting around, trying to find affordable places to live. If you were working in Sydney CBD, around where I am right now, I'm at the Opera House, Circular Quay. If you were working as a barista out here, and you know, inner city's too expensive to live, you'll never be able to buy here. Outer suburbs too expensive, you'll never be able to buy there. So suddenly you're traveling 2 hours commute to come into the morning to make people coffee for $35 an hour. 35 bucks an hour, call it that. How long are you going to do that for? Are you going to do that for 30 years, 40 years? Probably not, no. Why would you catch a train for 2 hours there, 2 hours back, so you can live in affordable living, so you can buy a house? It's 2 hours out of Sydney, yeah, it starts to become a little bit affordable. But why would you do that when you could just find a job locally, save yourself 4 hours of commuting a day? People are doing these numbers, people are running these numbers. People are saying, hey, you know what? It's not worth it. And then when everyone moves out of this city, when the exodus begins from Sydney, people flood out of here. You think, you know, for you rich fuckers watching right now, they're like, yeah, I've got several houses in Sydney. Do you think your house is going to be worth shit when there's no one living in the city? There's no one to service it. You have no service workers in here, no one working the cafes, the restaurants, no one doing the cleaning, no one, you know, in the retail stores. There's going to be a ghost city. It's going to be a mausoleum. Just empty, vacant houses all through it. Somehow still pegged at $2 million, $3 million. You think it's worth that? I don't think it is. I think when the population shifts out of a city and it becomes a ghost city because there's no services, no one to maintain that city, well, the city starts to collapse, doesn't it? I think that's going to happen. So I think Sydney has a clock on it, unless it can figure out a way to make affordable housing so the next generation of people living in Sydney or who want to live in Sydney have a shot of being able to buy a house here, have a shot of being able to settle down. Because currently there's abandoned houses. There's over 160,000 abandoned houses in Sydney. Tell me how your abandoned, ran down, rotting shack is worth $1.5 million because it's close to a CBD that one day will be a ghost town. Tell me that. Tell me that. Tell me how you're speculating on that. I think it's ridiculous. And I think it's disgusting that property prices have got this far gone. Anyway, guys, tell me what you think. For $1.6 million, would you buy a house in Sydney? Could you? Could you even do it? Could you afford to buy a house in Sydney on the salary that you're on right now for $1.6 million or a one-bedroom unit for $800,000? Tell me. Tell me in the comments. Am I wrong here or is it crazy? Anyway, guys, that's my thoughts on Sydney. You know, beautiful city to visit, but dude, I would not live here. I would not live here. It's too expensive. Anyway, guys, see you in the next one.